MP who tells us she's been preparing for conflict, and we hear from Ukrainians living close to the border with Russia. Also, the 15-year-old Russian ice skater Kamila Valieva has been allowed to compete at the Beijing Winter Olympics despite failing a drugs test. There's passionate reaction from a medal-winning Canadian skater. And we find out why thousands of sequoias are going to be planted in the UK.
Many thanks. Now here's Adam Rutherford to start the week.
Hello! The lives we live may be short and ephemeral, but life on Earth is long and continuous, almost 4 billion years without a break. And we talk of life on Earth, but really life is crafted by the land and the seas and the unending interplay with living things. Today we're deep into that prehistory. Thomas Halliday has written Other Lands, A World in the Making, a sweeping, lyrical biography of Earth, the geology, the biology, the extinctions, and the ever-shifting ecology that defines our living planet. And we're now in the Anthropocene, the era defined by our own effect on the Earth. And Rebecca Nesbitt tackles the present climate crisis and the stark choices we face in conservation in her book, Tickets for the Ark, From Wasps to Whales. And she asks a key question in that subtitle too: how do we choose what to save? And though we've desecrated the planet in the last 2 centuries, our impact on the changing land is much older. So we're starting today with one of the most iconic monuments from British prehistory, Stonehenge. A glorious new exhibition opens this week at the British Museum, which challenges our preconceptions about the simplest questions we can ask of Stonehenge. What was it for, and who built it? Curator Neil Wilkham has assembled beautiful objects from around Europe spanning centuries to take us into the changing landscape and people of Neolithic Britain. Neil, let's start with you, and let's start at the beginning. But your beginning is 1,000 years before we get to Stonehenge. As the exhibition starts, right up front there is this stunning German shamanic headdress, kind of like the type of thing that Björk would possibly wear. Why do you start there?
Well, Adam, it's really important to start before Stonehenge, because if we want to understand why the monument came about and why it was important to build it where it was, we have to think about the world that existed before the monument was built. And that's a world that's very different to our world, very different to the farming world that built Stonehenge. It's a hunter and gatherer community. It's people that are foraging for food and really living in tune with nature. And the objects you're describing are from an astonishing burial of a woman from Germany, Bad Dürrenberg. And she was buried with a whole range of wild animals, and she was sort of crowned, if you like, with this antler headdress. And she speaks to a world before farming. She speaks to a world when people lived with nature in a very different way to us today, but a very different way to the generations who came along next, if you like, the farmers who transformed the landscape, who cleared the woods, who domesticated animals, and really made fundamental transformations to the way we live with nature that we are still living with today.
Well, I mean, one thing that's very striking about the exhibition is it is about that sort of personal context, who these people were, but also that it's a very dynamic place. So this move from hunter-gatherer populations, and this isn't just at Stonehenge, but all over Europe, to agriculture. Do we have any evidence of how those people interacted?
Yeah, well, amazingly, in the exhibition we've got this material that you might walk past until you realise what it is. It's material from a feast where this hunter-gatherer communities in the Stonehenge landscape met with the first farmers and enjoyed breaking bread together, and they brought the various species. The hunter-gatherers brought their deer, the farmers brought their cattle, and they ate together, and that's a fantastic moment in time.
I think we often think of Stonehenge as a sort of static thing that's frozen in time, frozen in aspect, when actually what you see in the exhibition is that it's a very dynamic place. There's a lot of stuff happening over many centuries, but can we just do some of the nuts and bolts of it? So the date at which the first evidence of something at Stonehenge is built, and who are the people doing that?
Right, well, that goes right back to the hunter-gatherer times, which is what's fascinating. Already, before farmers, people are marking the landscape out as special, but it's the farmers who have a completely changed view of the landscape and what it means to possess land and territory. Those are the people who build the first Stonehenge, and that's about 3000 BC, when they bring the stones all the way from Wales and construct this remarkable site. And then it's, believe it or not, it's over 500 years later that the monument takes the form that you and I would recognise. Those sort of ghostly silhouettes of the Saracens on Salisbury Plain, they don't come along until about 2500 BC. So this is a site that was ancient in its own time, if you like. It had a rich past even when it was being constructed, and I think that's what the exhibition gets across. You're right, those sort of dynamic changes. But what we had to also get across is that this is built by people. This isn't some dry kind of architectural achievement. This is something that meant something deep, personal, and powerful to the people of the time. And those are the sort of figures that we're trying to pull out of that past, that deep past.
So who were those people? So initially, when Stonehenge was effectively a cemetery,
Yeah.
those people are the hunter-gatherers of Britain. I don't like to use the word indigenous, but they're the people before there was this demographic transition from Europe.
Right, but the first builders of the stone version of Stonehenge are the farmers, so they're farming people. That's the first builders. What's fascinating and what's coming into focus now with new scientific techniques of radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analysis is that Saracen phase, which is kind of the famous phase, may well have been built at the time when another group of people, separate from the farmers, are coming into Britain. And they're the first metalworkers, the so-called beaker people from Europe. So there's a fascinating possibility that's slowly coming into focus that perhaps the monument as we know it was built by another group of immigrants, in this case the metal people bringing metal into this country. So it's an incredibly dynamic story when it might seem at first to be quite a kind of staid and simplistic and sort of timeless story. It's actually got an awful lot of change built into the monument.
One of the most striking things about the exhibition when you come in is that it's in quite a long space, and at the back is a projection of the changing sun. And so that relationship between the sun and the way the stones are actually arranged, is that fundamental to the way that the Sarsen stones are erected and the way we see it today?
Absolutely, you can't underestimate the power of the sun for farming people. It's life or death. It's whether your crops are going to grow or not. And at midwinter, which is a key alignment at the monument, at midwinter, of course, the sun is at its weakest, and that's the time that you pray and hope that the sun's going to return.
I know it sounds like such a superficial question, but it is one that I think we can reasonably ask. What was it for?
Well, it was several things at different points, which is the boring answer. But the real fact of it is it was always meaningful. In the first instance, it was meaningful as a cemetery, and then latterly it was a place of worship. And I think what we found by doing this exhibition is that people at the time were very sensitive to their histories and probably knew them well from oral traditions that were passed down. But they were also very sensitive to the natural world.
Well, I'm going to bring Rebecca into the conversation now, because that is sort of one of the central themes with her book is just our changing relationship with the environment that we have shaped for the last 10,000 years or so. Did you see elements that are very familiar to us today in the exhibition at the British Museum?
Absolutely, and a lot of what's been said has really resonated with me, because it's embedded in our worldview that humans and nature are separate, but it hasn't always been that way, and seeing the exhibition has just made me think about how that wasn't the case for our ancestors, just as it isn't the case for lots of indigenous peoples around the world. And why should it be? Humans evolved as part of nature, or why do we think we're separate from it?
Yes, and so the ever-changing landscape is something that's very present, Neil, in Stonehenge. I guess a question that needs to be asked as well is that you describe beautifully and very persuasively that this thing has existed for thousands of years, and it changes, its purpose changes, the people changes, but ultimately it does fall out of use and becomes preserved in time, and the thing that we see on Salisbury Plains. Why did it stop being a dynamic place?
The story we tell in the exhibition is that power that the monument used to possess is moved south. It's moved to the south coast of England, we think. And that's because increasingly metal and bronze became the sort of driving force of power relations and of religion as well, I should say. It wasn't a sort of dry economic shift. So the power shifts, and the monument finds itself sort of out of time, out of place, out of position.
Thomas Halliday, you saw the exhibition last week. Did you see themes resonating in your work, thinking about deep history in the changing landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the position of sort of humans within the landscape as a natural entity is something that really fits with a paleontologist's view of world history as well. Of course, we're a relatively young species, a relatively young genus, and we have evolved alongside all of these creatures throughout Africa and then the world. There's controversial but potential evidence that we're even competing with species back in the Pliocene that we end up wiping out because they share a similar sort of mesopredator omnivorous niche. I mean, the giant otters, lion-sized otters that used to live alongside our ancestors back in in Canopy are no longer with us, and it has been argued that they declined as a result of competition with us.
Giant otters. Well, let's let's turn to Thomas Halliday's book Otherlands: A World in the Making. So we're trying to get a sense with Neil and the British Museum Stonehenge exhibition about the people who lived just a few thousand years ago. But with your book, we're going much deeper, all the way back to the formation of the Earth and the beginning of life on Earth, well before there were people by billions of years. How, as a paleontologist, have you been able to recreate these worlds? Because these time frames they're incomprehensible to us.
I agree. It's very hard to wrap your head around the millions of years, billions of years time frame, and I think, to some extent, through familiarity, it's sort of become normalised for me. But if you were to click your fingers every second and each second represent a year, to get to 1 million years, you'd have to be clicking your fingers for something like 9 or 10 days, I think. And to get to 1 billion years, you'd have to be doing it for about 32 years. Right, so it's a very, very long time period. And we also have problems where you can average out, in any one formation, it will have lasted hundreds of thousands of years or even more. So your any given site is sort of averaging out the inhabitants for a very long period of time. But in some cases you can get very precise things. I mean, Neil was talking about the isotope analysis that told us how individuals could move across a lifetime, and you can do the same kind of things with mammoth tusks to track their migration seasonally. And there's even been evidence in the last year of rocks that have been found in parts of the US where they don't naturally occur, and they've been argued to have been the gastroliths, the stomach stones of sauropod dinosaurs, that were then transported there as these huge beasts moved from landscape to landscape.
I think one of the things that I guess a lot of people think about fossils and fossil animals, so particularly the dinosaurs, which are so iconic and so important to how we think about the deep past. But nowadays, and for the last few decades, paleontologists have been getting immense detail at a molecular level out of these old fossilized bones. Give us some of your favourite examples of how we know things like the colours of animals that have died literally millions of years ago.
Yeah, well, colour is one of those things that can be preserved in a number of ways. So yes, when I was growing up, the dinosaur books would always have very speculative colours. But in the 90s, a specimen called Sinosauropteryx was discovered in China, which preserved feathers on this dinosaur. So Sinosauropteryx is quite a small predatory theropod dinosaur, so the sort of image of Velociraptor is generally the kind of thing that people will recognise. But its feathers are preserved at such a fine level because of the volcanic ash that forms the deposit that you can actually see cellular and subcellular structures.
Now, your book is very evocative of the past, and your lyrical descriptions of not just the landscape but also the animals as well. So you mentioned the giant killer otters. I may have added the word killer there, but also these giant penguins in the Eocene Antarctic. In the Devonian period, which is when's Devonian?
About 400 million years, a little over 400 million years ago.
These metre-high fungi that are like, you describe them as half-melted grey snowmen from Scotland. That's a very evocative description. What were these melted snowmen?
Yeah, so this is an organism called Prototaxites, and it is at a time when organisms are beginning to create ecosystems on the land. So there had been movement onto land before the Devonian, but it's really in the Devonian that communities of little plants and fungi and animals actually get going, sort of collaborating with one another. Fungi are so important to interactions between plant roots and the substrate, for example. So the only way of getting onto land is by this sort of wholesale collaboration and mutualistic interdependence. And Prototaxites is the only thing that's above a few centimetres tall at this time, and it is metres tall. And there's some evidence. I mean, it's certainly fungal, but there's a question about whether there's actually a lichen, a really, really tight interdependence between plants and fungi.
Now, we've been talking about living things, but a big theme of the book and that runs through it is the very natural state that extinction is the norm, and that most organisms that have ever existed are already extinct. There have been 5 great extinctions. Just take us through the biggies.
Well, the probably the most famous of them is the most recent, which is 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous. That's the one that wiped out all dinosaurs that weren't birds, as well as huge numbers of other species. I mean, we think of mammals as being the great survivors, and of course they radiated, they speciated into all sorts of diverse forms afterwards, but mammals were hit very hard as well at that time. In the late Cretaceous, there were more marsupial species in North America than there were placental species like our relatives. Before that, the biggest of them all, the end Permian mass extinction, was 252 million years ago, and that was caused by huge volcanic eruptions, the scale of which is almost unimaginable. Right? There are the lava plates, that what we call the Siberian traps, that are found all across Siberia today, the size of Australia, and so this is huge amounts of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere.
And in both of those cases, the proportions of organisms that are wiped out, permanently erased from the history of life on Earth is what? The numbers are huge.
Yeah, the end Cretaceous, we're looking at about 75%, of the end Permian about 95% of all living things. And the effects for the Permian, it's not just limited to life on land, right? We had huge, widespread deoxygenation of the oceans, which caused a huge amount of calamity for marine ecosystems.
And because we've seen this happen at least 5 times with these great mass extinctions, what is the sort of cycle? We talk about the mammals emerging from the KT boundary, the end of the dinosaurs era. But what happens in these sort of great resets, and what is the time scale involved in life on Earth resetting?
Well, the mass extinctions are a special case to some extent, because they are caused by some great calamity, whether that is a huge amount of volcanic activity or a meteorite striking the Earth and causing effectively like a nuclear winter. But recovery does happen, and you get life returning to the diversity it was before, but it usually takes on the order of at least a few 100,000 years or more.
Yeah, I promised myself I wouldn't cite Jurassic Park in this conversation, but I'm going to break that rule because life does always seem to find a way. I want to bring Rebecca in as well, because we are now, I think it's generally accepted that we're in the 6th great extinction, and Thomas was just describing how the timescales involved, even at those massive extinction level events, is still tens to hundreds of thousands of years for the full impact to transpire. The one we're in at the moment is happening at a timescale which is just orders of magnitude quicker, isn't it?
Yes, although something that struck me a lot about Tom's book is there are some similarities where things are happening very quickly. In terms of what you were saying about the very long time towards recovery, I think we just have no idea what's going to happen in the next few years, next 1,000 years, next hundreds of thousands of years. I think we might need to look back in many millennia to come to see exactly how similar are they.
Neil, do you see parallels in the way that Thomas describes these changing landscapes, even though they're over geological eras? Do you see parallels in the changes we see in the tens of thousands of years range that humans have affected the landscape?
I think what really struck me about Thomas's book is this idea that we get so hung up on individual elements of the past, whether that's dinosaurs or Stonehenge, and as a result we kind of lose the bigger picture.
Let's bring Rebecca Nesbitt and talk about her book, Tickets for the Ark, From Wasps to Whales. Now, the subtitle that I mentioned at the beginning is From Wasps to Whales, How Do We Choose What to Save? Now, there is a very stark implication right there in the title of your book, which is that we can't save everything.
Absolutely. We've already lost many species to extinction. We're not going to be able to bring them back, and that is continuing. Species are going extinct often before we've even discovered them, and I don't think that's going to change. However, we do have this amazing opportunity to really think about how our actions are affecting other species, including extinctions, and choosing the course that we want to now plot.
And you talk about many different attempts to change the course that you're plotting at the moment. Let's talk about one of them. You start with the establishment in Russia of what's being called Pleistocene Park. Tell us about the dreams of I think the Zimovs.
Exactly, a father and son team who want to return the area of Arctic Russia back to what's to some extent resembling a past state. They're not trying to take it back to the past, just being inspired by some of the ecosystem processes. And part of what's driving them is this knowledge that the permafrost is melting and we can have sort of runaway climate cycles based on this. Whereas when there were mammoths, for example, far more herbivores roaming the Arctic, they changed the ecosystem. They cleared it of trees, for example, and they grazed the snow. So the snow, which is now acting as an insulating layer, it was poured by animals in the ground. They needed to get through to this winter forage, so they removed lots of the snow. And he is trying to recreate some of these processes with the intention of protecting the permafrost, of fighting against climate change. And so he is bringing in lots of herbivores. Some are extinct, but he is bringing in, for example, modern horses, and they aspire to have, they can't have a mammoth, but a hairy elephant that is doing the job that the mammoth would have been doing.
Yes, I mean, you say that quite casually, but a hairy elephant is a new species that doesn't exist and hasn't evolved to live in this world, let alone one that is being attempted to be recreated. Is that a good idea?
I think this is a really important discussion to have, because who knows what is going to happen in terms of genetics in the next few years. There's just been a revolution in the last few years in how we can change a species' genetics, and that brings all sorts of possibilities, but they have to be done carefully.
And so the Pleistocene Park example, I suppose, is a version of something which we're beginning to talk about and have been for the last decade or so, which is rewilding, so allowing areas to return to nature. And I'm putting that in speech marks there, because what do we actually mean? What are they trying to return it to?
And rewilding is very interesting in that it means lots of different things to different people. To some people it means bringing in predators to try and again introduce some of these ecosystem processes that we've lost. To some people it means letting nature have a free rein, that some forms of conservation are very much about land management. We're going to dig up a tree, we're going to plant a tree, but rewilding can be about letting nature take its course. And given all the changes that nature has experienced, it may well be that the course it plots does not take us back to a past state, but brings about something new.
And I suppose we're very wedded to a romantic version of nature, and a lot of that involves thinking about big animals, so the charismatic megafauna. So that is a big part of our conservation over the last 100 years or so, that we want to save pandas or rhinos or lions. And actually that's not necessarily going to have the effect that we think it might be, when we should be thinking about Indonesian seagrass or worms.
Exactly. I have never heard anyone say, let's save the wasps. And whenever I say, well, I'm interested in parasite conservation, people think I'm mad. But there are all these unnoticed species which are doing amazing things for us. So if you think of the phytoplankton in the sea, for example, and their important role in reducing climate change, and if we only focus on the species that we love and that attract us, then we're going to lose lots of these amazing things that nature can do.
Yes, and you are asking some hard questions here, because ultimately we do have to make choices about which directions we go in, and people are romantic about honeybees because they're lovely, and wasps are generally perceived to be awful, even though that's one species out of, 100,000. So how do we encourage conversations about not regarding the uncharismatic and slightly annoying animals as being actually possibly arguably more important than the cute ones?
Exactly, and I think we probably all have a role to play in encouraging these conversations and challenging views. When someone expresses repulsion at a certain species, maybe we can all bring up some positive characteristics. And I think for some people, what they see in their gardens, what they see in the world around them is very important. And you mentioned hundreds of thousands of wasp species, that we believe there are hundreds of thousands of parasitoid wasps. They lay their eggs in a caterpillar, for example, And then we don't end up with butterfly, we end up with a load of wasps. And those are incredibly important in agriculture, for example, protecting our crops from lots of what we see as pest species. And it's the same in people's gardens. So if people start to just take notice, maybe look at what's in their vegetable patch, if they have a vegetable patch, and see, okay, that's not a fly, that little creature has a very long point coming out of its abdomen, and that's what lays eggs in the caterpillar. I think we can all just take a bit more notice of nature around us, ask ourselves questions about what that species might be, what it might do, and just start to think some more about what we're seeing.
Well, I think that one of the things you do very successfully in the book is ask the questions without necessarily steering the answers, because those answers are debates, they're arguments to be had. There's a connection with the Stonehenge exhibition in a little story that you mentioned, which is an attempt to bring back the auroch, an extinct giant cow, of which you have a one in the Stonehenge exhibition. It's a pretty interesting tale, the Heck brothers associated with the Nazis.
Exactly, and part of their idea of bringing back the aurochs was all tied up with a glorification of the peasant life, and one thing the two Heck brothers, Nazi supporters, wanted was they wanted this auroch's aggressive nature. And so they took domestic cow species with what they were seeing as primitive features and bred them until they had something that looked a lot like the extinct aurochs.
And the auroch in the Stonehenge exhibition has an axe head embedded in its head and was found, well, presumably in some kind of swamp.
It's found in Burwell Fen in Cambridgeshire with the axe still embedded in the skull, and it's a story of that animal species being driven to extinction in the course of the period that we're looking at in the exhibition.
Now, we're almost out of time, but I want to end on a positive note, because both Thomas's work and Rebecca's work, it does have optimism towards the end. It's very easy to have these conversations and think mass extinction, climate change, anthropogenic mass extinction that we're currently in, but both of you see optimism in our path forward.
Absolutely. I think what's more important than taking an optimistic or a pessimistic view is taking an active view rather than a passive one. Right? So we can be blindly optimistic and say, life has existed for hundreds of millions of years and will be fine. Life will find a way, but it's not going to find the same way that we have evolved with.
One thing I'm very optimistic about is that we can make a positive change, and we can let go of some idea that there's the correct state of nature that we need it to be in, and we can think about what future do we want to create.
We are out of time now, so it just leaves me to thank all of the guests. So Neil Wilkin, curator of The World of Stonehenge, that's at the British Museum, opens on Thursday and it runs until July. Thomas Halliday's book, Other Lands, A World in the Making, is out now, and Rebecca Nesbitt's Tickets for the Ark is published later this week. Many thanks to today's studio engineer, Duncan Hannant. Next week on Start the Week, it's Tom Sutcliffe on global merchants and the super rich. But for now, that's it. Thank you and goodbye.
Start the Week was presented by Adam Rutherford and it was produced by Katie Hickman. Before the World Tonight, let's take a quick look at the weather. Tonight will be mostly clear, chilly and dry. During the early hours, northern and western areas of the UK will see a band of rain move in from the west, but Scotland will have sleet and
22 hours.
snow on the hills. Tomorrow we'll have rain at first, clearing from many areas through the morning. In the afternoon, the south of England may see rain linger, while northern Britain will have showers, which will be wintry on the hills. Elsewhere, it'll be mostly dry with sunny spells, and it will be a breezy day. On Wednesday, rain will spread from the northwest, and it'll turn increasingly windy. Expect a very windy overnight. On FM, on longwave, and on DAB digital radio, this is Radio 4.
It's 10 o'clock. Good evening. This is The World Tonight with Rithala Shah. Western intelligence officials believe Russia is ready to mount an invasion of Ukraine and could move on Kiev within days. Ukraine's president addresses the nation and changes tone.
We
are frightened by the Great War, and the date of the military invasion is set again.
This is not the first time, but our state today is stronger than ever.
Orla Guerin hears how Ukrainians are preparing for the worst.
Some still have faith that the worst can be averted. If not, the fear in London and Washington is that Ukraine could face a devastating war within days.
The Russian ice skater Kamila Valieva competes again at the Beijing Games in a few hours' time, despite failing a drugs test. We ask a former skating gold medalist where this leaves the Olympic movement.
Somewhere in the trash can. How are we going to watch the rest of the Olympics and all these athletes without questioning what's right and who was treated fairly and who got special treatment?
That's all after the BBC News, read tonight by Lisa Costello. Western intelligence officials have indicated that Russia is ready to mount an invasion of Ukraine at any time and could move on the capital, Kiev, within days. The Pentagon said it did not believe President Putin had made a final decision on whether to attack, but warned he could move with little or no warning. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has told President Putin that diplomacy is far from being exhausted, but should not continue indefinitely. And tonight, the Ukrainian president said his army was stronger than ever and was ready to fight for freedom. With the latest from Kiev, here's our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams.
In a speech to the nation, President Zelensky struck a defiant note, still urging his people to stay calm and calling for peaceful negotiations, but declaring that February the 16th, the date cited by US officials as the day on which Russia could attack, will be, in his words, a day of unity. We want freedom, he said, and we're ready to fight for it. His statement came as Western intelligence officials painted an increasingly bleak picture of Russia's military plans, including a lightning strike on the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, in an effort to cripple the government. Vladimir Putin has yet to give the order, they said, but could do at any moment.
Boris Johnson and President Biden have agreed that a crucial window for diplomacy remains to persuade Russia to step back from its threats towards Ukraine. In a telephone call tonight, the two leaders reaffirmed their readiness to impose severe consequences on Russia in the event of further military escalation. Earlier, the US announced that it was moving its embassy staff in Ukraine from the capital, Kiev, to Lviv near the Polish border. With the latest from Washington, here's Barbara Pletosher.
Despite constant U.S. warnings of potential military action, the State Department said the Americans did not believe President Putin had made a decision yet about whether to invade Ukraine. And that's what we tell our partners, said the spokesman Ned Price. He was responding to suggestions that the U.S. had in fact told Ukraine there would be an invasion on Wednesday. Ukraine's president mentioned he'd received such a message, but didn't say from whom. Russia's foreign minister had sent a message about diplomacy, telling Mr. Putin that talks with the West should continue and expand. Mr. Price noted this comment, but was skeptical. What we haven't noted is any sign of de-escalation, he said. Prime Minister Boris Johnson reviewed both diplomatic and deterrence efforts in a call with the U.S. president, and the UN Secretary General told everyone to tone down the war rhetoric.
The AA says the average cost of fuel at pumps across the UK has reached a new record high. The price per litre is now just over £1.48. The Petrol Retailers Association has warned the situation remains volatile. Here's our business correspondent, Katie Austin.
The price of oil hit a 7-year high this morning, around $95 a barrel, amid concerns about the impact that an invasion of Ukraine by Russia would have. Drivers can now expect to pay just over 148 pence for a litre of petrol, surpassing the previous high set in late November. Diesel has now risen above 151 pence a litre. The RAC predicted that with the oil price so high and retailers keen to pass on the increase in wholesale fuel quickly, new records could now be set on a daily basis.
Northern Ireland's health minister has announced that all the remaining COVID restrictions will be lifted from tomorrow because the Omicron variant isn't putting significant pressure on hospitals. Ahead of the announcement, Robin Swan consulted with all 5 parties in the devolved government, which currently can't meet after the resignation of the First Minister, Paul Givan, 10 days ago. The Metropolitan Police Federation, which represents more than 30,000 rank-and-file officers, has declared it has no faith in the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. The move is in response to what it called the very public ousting of Dame Cressida Dick as the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. Mr Khan says a significant change is needed at the Met following a series of devastating scandals. But Ken Marsh, the chairman of the Metropolitan Police Federation, says he's fed up with officers being lambasted.
I blame the mayor for his language. I'm not against change. None of us are against change. We all accept there needs to be a change. We all accept what has taken place is not acceptable. But it's a very, very few officers. And we have to think of the 32,000 that you need to take with you with change. And they're not discussing that at all.
A former sub-postmaster who was forced into bankruptcy because of a faulty computer system has broken down in tears giving evidence on the first day of a public inquiry into the scandal. The Horizon software made it look as though money was disappearing. The problem was reported shortly after the system was introduced in 2000, but the Post Office prosecuted hundreds of sub-postmasters and mistresses for theft until 2014. Baljit Sethi, who used to run 2 post offices in Essex, was the first to give evidence, describing how his complaints were ignored for months.
I had by that time nearly 20 years experience running a post office. So I knew exactly that if I could balance the books when they were done manually, why should I not balance here? I'm not taking out any money. I'm not doing anything illegal. So why is this showing that there surely has to be something wrong in the system? But at that stage, the post office didn't want to know that.
The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, is to personally oversee decisions to move the most high-risk offenders to open prisons. The announcement comes after Paul Robson, described as a dangerous sex offender, absconded from a jail in Boston in Lincolnshire over the weekend. Police said he was a particular risk to women and young children. The government has given more detail on how it intends to make developers and manufacturers in the housing industry shoulder the costs of replacing dangerous cladding. The Department for Levelling Up said the plans could see builders and manufacturers in effect blocked from the housing market if they don't help. The period leaseholders have to sue developers is to be extended from 6 years to 30. A study of nearly 260 rivers around the world has detected potentially toxic levels of pharmaceutical drugs in a quarter of them. Researchers from the University of York said drugs used to treat epilepsy and diabetes were the most widely found. Rivers on every continent contained paracetamol, nicotine and caffeine. Scientists say the scale of pollution threatens wildlife and could affect human health. The teenage Russian figure skater Kamila Valieva is preparing to compete again at the Beijing Olympics after sport's top court ruled she could go back to the rink despite failing a drugs test. The 15-year-old helped secure a gold in a team event last week and is a favourite in the singles competition tomorrow. But the medals she wins won't be awarded until further investigations and appeals have taken place. More on that story a bit later. Thank you, Lisa. You're listening to The World Tonight with Ritula Shah. The warnings from Washington and its NATO allies are ominous. A Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent. But even as those warnings of impending conflict have grown louder, Ukraine's President Zelensky's remained calm. He's even urged world leaders of overstating the likelihood of war. But this evening he addressed the nation with a very different tone.
Нас лякають великою війною і вкотре призначають дату воєнного.
We are frightened by the Great War, and the date of the military invasion is set again. This is not the first time, but our state today is stronger than ever.
The president praised his army and claimed that Donbass and Crimea, taken by the Russians in 2014, would return to Ukraine. He also told us when he thinks the Russians will make their move.
Нам кажуть, що 16
We are told that February 16th will be the day of the attack. We will make it the day of unity. The relevant decree has already been signed. On this day, we will hoist national flags, put on blue and yellow ribbons, and show the world our unity. We have one great European aspiration. We want freedom and are ready to fight for it. We all want to live happily, and happiness loves the strong. We have never been able to give up, and we are not going to learn that. Love Ukraine. We are calm. We are strong. We are together.
Well, the president praised his army and claimed that Donbass and Crimea would be returned to Ukraine. More evidence of how seriously the threat of conflict is being treated came with the US announcement that it's evacuating its embassy in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, and relocating to Lviv in the west of the country. But there also appears to be a concerted effort to keep diplomatic lines open. In Russia, during a carefully orchestrated and socially distanced appearance on television, President Putin asked his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov if there was a chance to reach an agreement with the West, or whether the diplomacy was an attempt to drag us into an endless negotiation protest.
Шанс есть всегда, и ваши последние контакты с руководителями Соединенных Штатов.
Mr. Lavrov replied that there's always a chance. The possibilities are far from being exhausted. They certainly should not continue indefinitely, but he said I would suggest continuing and ramping them up. Meanwhile, Downing Street says that Boris Johnson spoke to President Biden this evening, and we're told they agreed there remained a crucial window for diplomacy and for Russia to step back from its threats towards Ukraine. Tonight, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres spoke to reporters after attending a meeting with members of the UN Security Council. He said he was worried by the heightened tension and would do everything possible to prevent war.
I've made my good offices available, and we will have no stone unturned in the search for a peaceful solution. Abandoning diplomacy for confrontation is not a step over a line, it is a dive over a cliff. In short, my appeal is this: do not fail the cause of peace.
Well, those grim warnings from London and Washington that an invasion may be imminent is a particular concern for Ukrainian communities living along the border with Russia. They're within easy reach of President Putin's forces massed just across the frontier. Our international correspondent Orla Gerens travelled to the port city of Mariupol in eastern Ukraine, which is just 30 miles from that border with Russia.
Well, it's a sunny afternoon, and there's a very incongruous sight just in front of me. We're at a sports centre in Mariupol, but nobody's playing football. They've gathered here today to play with guns, or at least to learn how to use them. There's a long line of people in front of me, both men and women, young and old, and in the last few hours they've been learning how to load and fire assault rifles. Valentina Konstantinovka is one of those getting to grips with an AK-47, assembling the weapon under the careful eye of an instructor from the National Guard. He tells her to point it in a safe direction. Valentina has a shock of white hair and is bundled up in a gold winter coat. She's a grandmother, aged 78, who is determined to defend her motherland.
I am a very peaceful person, and I can forgive a lot of things. I can give away everything. But when something is taken against my will, when an invader comes, I will resist, and I will be furious.
I'm with Yaroslav, who's 25 and who's leading some of the training here today. Yaroslav, tell me, why is it important for you to provide this training now? Are you worried that there may be a Russian invasion?
You never know, these crazy people, Putin and stuff, what they think, what they plan. Of course, we hope that there won't be any war, because all of us have families in the cities, and we don't want the blood spill and stuff. But in case any enemy want to grab our lands, we are ready to protect it.
In times of crisis, many draw strength from their faith and from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which broke away from Russia in 2019. The Church of St. Peter Mohila is crowded during our visit. The congregation stand with heads bowed, surrounded by candles and ornate icons. There are prayers for Ukrainian soldiers already on the front line. The service is led by a bearded young priest, Father Roman Perichachko.
People have stopped being anxious. Fear has faded away. The war has been going on for 8 years. There's nothing left to fear. We just need to take action and change things. People are fed up with being scared, I should say.
Do you think this is a game just to sort of pressure Ukraine, that it's all a big show?
I think that his regime, Putin's regime, is approaching its end, and everything happening right now, probably a convulsion before its death.
We're outside the church now with Irina, who's just been attending the service. Irina, can you tell me, what are your feelings about the general situation now in Ukraine? Are you worried that there could be an invasion by Russia?
I don't know. I'm not a military expert. I don't know what's happening and what kind of a threat it is. I think that diplomatically, somehow, we will overcome the crisis. That's what I think. I don't think that all Russians support such an aggression towards Ukraine. I don't think so.
Some still have faith that the worst can be averted. If not, the fear in London and Washington is that Ukraine could face a devastating war within days.
Orla Guerin reporting. Well, let's return to tonight's speech by President Zelensky, in which he said his army is stronger than ever and was ready to fight for freedom. Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadeh is an opposition MP and a former vice premier of Ukraine, and also a former minister for European integration. I asked her what she made of the president's statement.
I think it's important that finally he has come out with a statement to the nation. We have to stay united, we have to be strong, we are prepared to withhold the possible attack, and that they are watching different scenarios and are getting ready to respond to different scenarios. I think it was important for the people to hear such assurances from the president of the country.
It began, "We are frightened by the Great War," which seems like a very different tone from President Zelensky. Until quite recently, he's been sort of suggesting that there's no reason to fear a conflict, urging Western leaders to calm down.
Unfortunately, even in this particular statement that he was giving this night, he didn't call aggressor an aggressor. He was saying there is a war being waged against us, there are troops being gathered around our borders, but he didn't name a spade, specifically probably done for the Russian audience rather
So
than
you're saying
for
he
the
didn't
Ukrainian.
mention Russia by name?
Exactly, he did not. That's something that I disagree with. But with regard to what you were asking, that whether there is a change of tone in his rhetoric, well, at least I think there is a little bit more objectivity and sobriety in assessment of the challenges we are facing and threats.
But why do you think he's changed his tone? I mean, the information he's been getting is presumably what everybody else has been hearing, a lot more, one imagines. So why do you think he's taken this different tone now?
I think it's both the actual situation around Ukraine with Russia's behavior. It's also about that Ukrainians are demanding